Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by Hep United and Hepatitis B Foundation. My name is Kate Morars. I'm the Deputy Director of Public Health with the Hepatitis B Foundation and Director of Hep United. Today's webinar is focused on hepatitis B patient engagement. Our panelists will report on the first hepatitis B externally led patient-focused drug development meeting that was held in collaboration with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in 2020. And we'll also discuss results from an international hepatitis B patient survey and share preliminary data from focused interviews that were conducted over the past year. We'll also hear directly from a patient advocate who is part of the Hepatitis B Foundation's Just Be Storytelling campaign. Before we get started, I wanted to review a few housekeeping items. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have any technical difficulties with audio on your computer, just hit the phone call option and the dial-in numbers will pop up on your control panel. Finally, if you have any questions for any of the panelists, please feel free to type them in the question box at any time during the presentations, and we will have a Q&A session at the conclusion of all the presentations. Okay. So this webinar is being hosted by Hep United as part of our capacity building training series. Hep United is a national coalition that is co-chaired by the Hepatitis B Foundation and the Association of Asian Pacific Community Health Organizations. Hep United is comprised of 49 local coalitions and national organizations in 29 cities and 22 states, including Washington, D.C. Our mission is dedicated to reducing the health disparities associated with hepatitis B by increasing screening, awareness, vaccination, and logistic care for high-risk communities across the United States. And you can visit www.hepunited.org to get in touch with any of our local partners. Before we go into our presentation today, I wanted to provide my colleague Beatrice Zovich with an opportunity to talk about one of the programs that we're partnering Hep United is partnering on that is related to clinical research.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for having me, and I'll just take a couple of minutes to talk about the All of Us research program. So this is a program that is working to increase diversity in medical research. So right now, many medical decisions and much healthcare is made based on information about the average patient, which is typically someone who is Caucasian and male, and it doesn't reflect the full diversity of the United States and of everyone who makes up the population. So All of Us is working to try to change that. And they're doing that by trying to increase the practice of something called precision medicine, which is making healthcare tailored to individual people. So just like a glasses prescription would be tailored to one person specifically and no one else could use it, the goal is to make healthcare as precise and individualized as that. And one cool thing about the project is that it not only uses biological factors, so things like height and weight and blood pressure, but also takes into account things like your family history and genetics, where you live, what you do, educational level, what you do in your free time, everything that kind of makes up your health story. So this project is trying to recruit 1 million people to participate, and so far are at 350,000. So a good start, but still has a way to go and is trying to recruit more participants. And just a quick overview of kind of what's involved with the program. It involves sharing your electronic health record, so just your basic kind of medical chart, as well as completing surveys and submitting biosamples, so saliva and blood, and also using medical tracking apps, so things like Fitbits and things to kind of track your exercise, food, sleep, things like that. All of your data is highly secure and private, and none of your personal information contains your name or is attached to any of your health data. And it's a really great opportunity to kind of improve the health of your community, both in the present and for future generations, and to be a part of an exciting research opportunity. So in order to participate, you can visit www.joinallofus.org, and I can put that in the chat box as well. And that also has much more information about the project. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Beatrice, for sharing with us today. All right, so we are going to jump right into the introduction of all of our speakers. First up, we have Dr. Sherry Cohen, who is going to kick us off with an overview of our patient engagement programs and the patient-focused drug development meeting. And then following Sherry, we will have David Urich, our Just Be campaign storyteller. I'll share a little bit about his experience and perspectives. And then we will close up with Dr. Yasmin Ibrahim, who will share with us findings from the International Patient Survey. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Sherry.
Thank you, Kate. I am going to talk to you guys today a little bit about our patient engagement program and the goals and activities, and also about the externally led patient-focused drug development meeting that the Hepatitis B Foundation hosted last June. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the reasons we started this patient engagement program overall is because we know that there are a lot of drugs coming through the pipeline. We hope that they will ultimately lead to cure or functional cure. But with all of these new potential drugs and clinical trials on the horizon, we thought it was a really important time to ask questions that we haven't had the chance to ask for a long time. And so really engaging with patients and people living with hepatitis B to find out from them how chronic hepatitis B is impacting their lives, what kinds of experiences have they had with current treatments, and what's still missing, and what do they want from the future? What do they want in terms of future treatments and clinical trials, and how can we help? You know, one of the things we know with clinical trials coming down the pike is that we will need people to participate in them. Otherwise, if we don't have enough people to participate in the trials, we'll never get the drugs approved. And so how can we potentially use what we learn to improve engagement and recruitment and participation in clinical trials moving forward? Next slide. So the patient-focused drug development program started with the FDA. It is an FDA program, and it's about 10 years old. They've hosted about 35 PFDD meetings, and the goal of the PFDD meeting, patient-focused drug development meeting in general, is to document the impact of living with specific diseases and to hear from people living with conditions what they want from future treatment, what they need from current, and what their experiences are from current treatments as well. The FDA hosts these either on their own, or you can have an externally led PFDD meeting, meaning it's not really hosted by the FDA, it's hosted by an outside organization. Ours was externally led. So we did work with the FDA to come up with the agenda for the day and make sure that we were in line with the goals and the mission of the PFDD program, but we actually hosted the meeting itself. And for us, our specific goal was to document the lived experience of having chronic hepatitis B, and hopefully taking what we learned about people living with hepatitis B and what their wants and needs were in terms of meds, that for the future we could inform the drug development and regulatory review process for new drugs, and ultimately leading to drugs that had more impact, more meaningful impact on people's lives. Next, please. We had Thank you. We have 4 specific objectives. One was to better understand the physical, psychological, professional, and social impacts of living with Hep B. The second one was to document what people want and need in terms of treatments. The third was to document what people are willing to accept in terms of routes of administration, treatment duration, and side effects with future clinical trials. And then also to better understand barriers to accessing treatment, including stigma and discrimination. We worked with the FDA for about 9 months when we met with them every other week, and worked with them to develop the agenda, to develop the questions, to develop the process. We actually had to go through an official approval process before we even worked with them. So we had to submit a letter of intent to the FDA talking about why we needed a PFDD meeting for hepatitis B, why it needed to be now, and what we thought we could get out of it, how we would use the information we learned. Once we got approval, then we were able to start working on it. And our goal was to make sure that we could hear from as many people who had hepatitis B as possible, and from as diverse a group as possible as well, hoping to have people from inside the US and outside the US as well. Of course, we had to change midway. We were always scheduled for June of last year. It was supposed to be in person at the FDA. Because of the pandemic, we had to switch to a fully virtual platform. So we actually were the first fully virtual PFDD meeting ever. And that added a whole host of other planning issues. But at the same time, we didn't have to bring people in from around the country to one place. So we didn't have to worry about travel logistics, which made life a little bit easier, I think, for that. And then the meeting format, again, because it was virtual, we decided we wanted to make it as interactive and engaging as possible and make sure that we could hear from people in different ways. So one is we knew we wanted to have a panel of expert speakers, people living with hepatitis B who could talk about specific aspects. We wanted to have some time for open discussion, and that meant how can we get others engaged? So we had a phone line so that people could call in with their questions, and they could ask their questions live on the air during the live stream, and panelists could answer those questions or just use them as food for thought. We also instituted polling questions throughout so that people who were participating in the audience could answer the polling questions, and then we opened up a line where people could submit email comments for 30 days. And this gave them a chance to make their comments a little bit more substantial. Next. So we wound up with 4 overall session themes. One was the individual impact of living with Hep B, the societal impact of living with Hep B, current experiences and on treatment, and future experiences. We did have, I think one of the nice parts about having this virtually was we were able to open it up to more people. We had 650 people participants who were on with us through that live stream. And according to the polling, about 2/3 were living with Hep B and 1/3 were family members. We had 80% of the participants that day were living in the US, and 20% were living outside the US. We also were able to collect 144 comments throughout that 30-day period. We actually collected more, but we had some doubles. And 56% of them were from people outside the US. So you could see that we were able to get engagement from people around the world. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we learned that day, and I broke it up based on those 4 themes. So the first theme was physical impact, and what we learned was that the physical health effects of living with hepatitis B span the range, right? Just because someone, from asymptomatic to end-stage liver disease and liver cancer. What we primarily heard from people were their thoughts on chronic fatigue and pain. And unrelenting chronic fatigue was the primary physical issue that most people talked about, and most people talked about it in a way that it was a defining part of their lives. It impacted work, school, social life, family life, caring for children, and it did lead to some isolation and also regret about things that people couldn't do because they were always feeling tired. We also heard quite a lot about pain, joint pain, muscle pain, and body aches, and that these did have a significant impact on people's lives. And it impacted, again, their ability to work, education, to complete education, to socialize. And people thought that, I think between the fatigue and the pain, that they were enough that they impacted their daily routines and made it difficult for them to complete their daily things that they thought they needed to do just to get by through every day. People also talked about digestive issues, although to a lesser extent. And then, of course, people were, and we'll talk more later, but people were concerned about possible physical side effects of antiviral treatment that they were on. Next slide. So from the next theme, we have the impact of chronic hepatitis B on personal and social lives. And so we learned a lot about fear, anxiety, and stress. And the fact that these were pervasive. Just about everyone we heard from and all the people that submitted comments worried about the long-term health impacts of chronic hepatitis B and the worry of potentially one day developing liver cancer and dying young was very pervasive. People were also scared of transmitting hepatitis B to other people, and that especially spouses and children, and that it impacted potential romantic relationships or potential, it impacted what they did. And so some people actually changed their routines and changed their social lives because they were afraid of transmitting the disease to other people. Also, we learned about the harmful impact of lifelong treatment. So people feeling like it was a daily reminder for them if they had to take medication. They didn't want to start medication because they didn't want to have to be on medication for a long time, but they were often afraid not to do something about their hepatitis B. We also heard a lot from people who sort of self-isolated as a result of their fear and anxiety, limiting their social interactions, a fear of being discriminated against, so avoiding specific interactions as well. We heard from people that going to parties and going to places where alcohol would be plentiful was a burden because they felt like they had to explain themselves to others. And we did hear from people that not only, sometimes family, friends, and coworkers were a source of stigma and anxiety, but also that it impacted. So their own stigma and their own feelings of fear and anxiety actually impacted family members and friends as well. And then we did hear about the importance of making connections. So being able to connect with other people who had hepatitis B was one way that folks were hoping to overcome their own feelings of isolation. Next slide. We heard quite a lot about stigma, harassment, and discrimination. People who explained that they had lost jobs, that they were being discharged from the military, that their kids had been expelled from daycare. People were very scared about being discriminated against, and so often just did not share their hepatitis B status with either anyone or with just a couple of few close people in their lives. I think we did hear both from people about self-stigma, so the stigma I think that folks were putting on themselves, and then outside stigma that they felt that they were getting from other people or society in general. And people did talk about the fact that we need to raise more public awareness to help counter misinformation, which leads to stigma as well. And then we heard from people about feeling shamed. Often people not only are scared of transmitting the virus, but blame themselves almost for having it and for transmitting it, potentially even transmitting it to others. And often talked about the need for having more support for them and their family members so people could move beyond that and help take care of their health and help move on with their lives. And also we heard from a number of people about the positive impact of the storytelling. So hearing stories from others who knew what they were going through was very, very helpful and hopeful. Next slide. So the third theme were we asked people to talk about their experiences with current treatments. And while many people felt that the current treatments have improved their lives, some people also felt that there were burdens with the current treatment. So again, having a daily reminder, even though the pill seems to be, a lot of people were mentioning that it was easy to take and that they had few side effects. We had quite a few people who commented that they did have significant side effects from their antiviral medication, and that it doesn't sound difficult to take a pill every day, but it can be, and it can be also, sort of fostering those feelings of fear about the future as a daily reminder. We also heard from people that even when they're on antiviral treatment, they were still afraid of the possibility of progressing. And especially we heard from people who are not on treatment that they are nervous because they don't feel like they're not necessarily taking action. They're worried because they're not on antivirals. They felt uncertain about the future. And what we heard from people is that because of these fears, they were adopting maybe natural remedies or making sure that they were staying healthy diet, healthy exercise, mindful meditation. People were talking about ways that they're trying to overcome that fear that lingers about the future. Next slide. In thinking about the future, of course, one of the most important things that we heard from people through the comments and through the panels and panelists and people who called in were that they want a functional cure. If a cure can't happen, then people want a functional cure for hepatitis B. Over and over again, we heard that having a finite duration of therapy is important rather than feeling like you're going to go on antivirals and have to be on them for many years. I think, more than anything, we heard that people want their risk of liver cancer to be reduced significantly to maybe even to a level of someone who doesn't have hepatitis B. They want the fear of liver cancer gone. And also undetectable surface antigen was considered very, very important, especially from those who were writing to us from outside the US, where a positive surface antigen test can actually make you ineligible for jobs or for school in some places, or even for immigration. So I think those were the most important things that we heard about. People, of course, I think, in general, there seemed to be a preference for oral treatment over injections or IV infusion, but there were quite a few people who were willing to accept injectable medications or IV infusions, especially if they were limited in duration. So it seemed as though people were more amenable to injections or IV infusions if they were a couple of months or 6 months versus 1 or 2 years. And then we did hear that people were potentially willing to tolerate inconveniences in their daily life, including potential side effects, if it meant that they had a greater chance to achieve a functional cure. That's how important it is for people. Next. So in terms of clinical trials, we did see that quite a few people would be willing to consider participating in a clinical trial in the future, especially if that clinical trial, if that experimental medication or combination of medications could lead to a functional cure. I think that is the one thing we learned, is that people were concerned about experimental drugs, they were concerned about potential side effects, but if, for a high chance of getting a cure, a functional cure, people seem to be willing to join a clinical trial, especially when they felt so much physical, emotional, and social impact of the disease itself. People are concerned, however, about the possible side effects, possible burden of participation. And so I think what we're hearing from people is that for future clinical trials for hepatitis B, we need to find ways to help with recruitment and help people stay in clinical trials long term. And that's where we're going to be looking this year to collect some more data and find out what that might look like. People mentioned the idea of having emotional support, some kind of online support group or support throughout a clinical trial. The idea that maybe they don't have to travel to a faraway site all the time for checkups. Maybe they could make clinical trials more accessible to where people live. So these are the kinds of things that we heard about, and hopefully we'll be able to collect a little more data about that this year to go more in depth. Next slide. So this is just a quick overview. I can go through them really quickly. Basically, what we learned is that there are significant physical and emotional impact for people who live with hepatitis B, and that it does impact and reduce their daily life, their quality of life. It can impact their relationships with family, close friends. It can impact their career trajectory, and even where they live and where they choose to live. There are definitely current treatment challenges for people both in the US and outside the US, including the fact that the medications are daily and long-term, and that some people have cost and access issues. And there is a very strong desire for some kind of treatment or combination of treatment that would reduce, that would lead to loss of surface antigen and reduce the risk of liver cancer. Next slide. We also learned that most people preferred oral treatment, but that injectables would be considered acceptable by many, many people. Of course, with mild or limited side effects, that would be considered ideal. But there is a willingness to participate in clinical trial for a chance of a functional cure. Next slide. I just wanted to take a minute and thank all of the people who participated in our PFDD meeting, people who, some people were on the other side of the world and were calling in the middle of the night. So people who they took off from work, they just wanted to make sure that they helped us out and that their voice was heard, and we're so grateful. We're also very thankful for the FDA for partnering on this project. I mean, they clearly were prioritizing the voice of people living with hepatitis B, and that means a lot to us. And thanks to all of our partners who helped out as well. The report is, by the way, open and free and on our website. So everything I mentioned today is in the report and actually goes into more depth. So you can download it and read it at your leisure. The 4.5-hour PFDD meeting itself is also online. You can go and watch all of it or parts of it. And then finally, I would like to transition over and talk a little bit about our storytelling program and our Be the Voice international storytelling program. Most of you have heard of our Just Be storytelling program, at least I hope. We have had the privilege of working with people who have hepatitis B and their family members for the past 4 years around the US. And they are playing an integral role in improving awareness, in getting people tested and into care, in reducing stigma, and just in prioritizing hepatitis B. And our Just Be storytellers made up the majority of our panelists on our PFDD meeting. And so we're just so honored to be working with them. I did want to announce that late last year, we launched the Be the Voice Story Bank, which is our international storytelling program. Unfortunately, terrible timing because we actually can't go around the world collecting stories, but we are doing it virtually. So we already have applications from 19 people in, I think, 11 countries, and we're going through those. We should be putting the stories up soon, and hopefully we'll get a chance to virtually or in person work with people who have hepatitis B around the world. And with that, Kate, I will hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. That was really exciting news about the international efforts and really great findings from the PFDD meeting. And we will be sure to share materials from the PFDD meeting in a follow-up email so that everyone who is attending has a copy. Next, we'll transition over to actually one of the panelists from the PFDD meeting, David, who's joining us today to share his personal experience living with hepatitis B. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Kate. Hi, everyone. My name is David Urich. I'm one of the Just Be storytellers. Got my shirt on today. I feel very honored to be here. I'm going to be talking about my experience as a patient living with Hep B, my thoughts on accessing treatment, clinical trial participation, and possible cures. First, a little background on my story. I'm almost 32 years old. Hepatitis B has been with me since almost birth. It was transmitted to me perinatally through my birth mother, and I was adopted out of South Korea several months later to a wonderful family in Michigan, where I've been living ever since. I did get semi-annual blood work growing up, but until the age of 13, I had no idea that hepatitis was a part of me. That first meeting with the liver doctor was definitely one of the most significant moments in my life. My parents had told me several days previously about my Hep B status and set up an appointment. And while most of that visit seems like a blur, I do remember feeling like my life was over after I left that meeting. I had some questions answered, and I believe I was given some basic information on the virus and what it could mean for me. But the main point taking away from that was a lot of fear and hopelessness. That led to a lot of isolation in my teenage years. I didn't actually speak about hepatitis B with anyone besides that doctor until I was 18 years old. So I went through high school with it completely just hidden away inside me, kind of ignoring it at the same time. But finally, when I did speak up and found the courage to talk to my brother and some close friends about it, at the time it didn't feel that way, but knowing what I know now, it was one of the most significant moments for me also with living with this disease, because I think that moment of talking about it to friends and family was one of the first moments that I could normalize it a bit to myself and start to think of myself not as an individual with being alone, but someone that could get help. I'm almost 32 now. It's almost been 2 years since I had a liver biopsy done. This was done after some consistent periods of time with high AST readings. I'll be the first to admit I was making very risky lifestyle choices at the time, especially with alcohol, and eventually it caught up with me a bit, and a biopsy was suggested, and after some deliberation, I decided to go through with it. Shortly after that, I was put on tenofovir, and almost within a month or two, my viral loads went from in the high 100 millions to almost completely undetectable, which has just been a complete game changer for me mentally. Just talking about a little bit about what it's like to live day to day with this. It's never easy. There always seems to be at least one or two things that come up each day where it's either you thinking, how is this going to progress in the future? Even being on a medication that's working well, I still have those fears, and it's something I've had to deal with for quite a while. And what I've learned over the years is that when questions that cause a lot of anxiety for me come up, I'll try to answer the question with another question. For example, say if I'm worrying about my medication, I'll try to balance that with wondering and kind of believing that it will work as intended, and that can help with those fears sometimes. But every day is a struggle in some way. I've spoken about my Hep B in public and online many times, as I'm doing right now, but that still doesn't make talking about it an easy endeavor to take on. You know, everyone is different that you'll talk to this about or choose to talk to this about, and in my experience, some people will, you know, be receptive to it, and some people might pull back a little bit because either lack of knowledge or something else, and you can never really know for sure what's going to happen as a patient when you reveal your status to someone. I think it's up to us as individuals to judge each situation appropriately and figure out whether it's the best decision for us, whether to tell a family member, friend, or colleague. But for me personally, what I do know is being able to talk about it with my friends and family is one of the great comforts I do have. As far as living healthy as a hepatitis B patient, that can be interpreted in many ways, and there are many methods to live a healthy life, especially if you're not on medication, which was me until the age of 30. I remember thinking a lot that I was kind of not in control of any aspect of my disease, because I essentially thought it was just a wait and see approach with my Hep, and that eventually there would come a day when I was older that it would get worse, and that I would have to have surgery or something like that. And those thoughts definitely can detract from living a healthy life. And I remember just constantly thinking, kind of, where is the future going to be for me? What does my future look like? There are ways to live healthy and give yourself the best chance of having a healthy liver, but sometimes it is difficult because they're just normal basic healthy lifestyle choices, such as what you put in your body, avoiding alcohol, mental techniques as far as managing stress, connection with others, communicating about your illness. These are all factors that can really make an impact on your health as a patient, and something I've tried to pay attention to over the years, as far as doing at least a weekly stock of kind of how I'm doing with diet and exercise. You know, I struggle just as much as the average person with these things, but there are many resources out there, especially through the Hepatitis B Foundation page on Facebook, with great information on diet and lifestyle choices that I think could give some patients that are kind of stuck in that limbo of being positive but not being able to be eligible for medication or treatment. My thoughts on accessing treatment. Early on with Hep B, especially in my high school years, I remember the first liver panel test I got back and really looked at, I tried to understand, and it was just a completely foreign language to me. And reading on some resources online and talking to my doctor, answered some questions, but I couldn't quite seem to get some things cemented in my head to where I felt comfortable analyzing test results. It kind of made me feel like I had no basis in how my Hep B was doing or how the general health of my liver was doing, and that just in turn made me feel a bit more disconnected from my disease in general, and that can lead to not setting up doctor's appointments or just being apathetic about your disease in general, which, you know, in the short term might take some of those thoughts away, but eventually they will come back and they will be worse. I remember it being very difficult mentally to be in that situation before I was on medication, where I was essentially very healthy. I don't suffer too much from any of the fatigue that others have dealt with. I would consider myself fairly asymptomatic through most of my life, but fear of the future and just kind of describing it as like thinking of my liver as being an hourglass that's slowly draining with sand, and just one day it would run out. That was kind of how I thought about the trajectory of this disease for a long time, and it was very, very stressful and painful to think about that way. You know, I've been seeing liver doctors for as long as I can remember, and it's only until recently that I've sort of learned to be confident enough in myself as a patient to ask any question I might have, and to also, for me personally, be honest about lifestyle choices. If I hadn't been honest about my drinking and some risky choices I had made before my biopsy, it would have never happened, at least in the way it did. And I think there's a freedom as a patient in kind of just accepting the doctor-patient relationship as a healthy thing when there's complete transparency between patient and doctor. And I think, as far as my thoughts on access and treatment, being able to communicate like this with my hepatologist makes it so much easier to think about treatments or ask questions, especially when they suggested a biopsy, because I certainly had a lot of questions about that and what that could lead to. When they started talking about medications, I had a lot of questions I had to ask, and even though I could have found the answers online, it felt better to speak with my doctor about it and just further build rapport with her. I will say about the tenofovir that I've been on, again, seeing those viral numbers go down, for me personally, sometimes very analytical, and being able to see physical numbers on a sheet in front of me representing at least transmissibility for Hep B, seeing that go down was one of the greatest reliefs in my life, because either irrationally or not, I've always worried about transmission as one of my worst fears. I always thought as a younger person that I would never forgive myself if I had inadvertently transmitted this to someone, and just seeing the likelihood of that happening go down is just one of the greatest reliefs a patient can feel, at least for me. My thoughts on a current treatments like the one I'm on, participating in clinical trials. I think ideally, what a functional cure and what accessing a clinical trial, what would motivate me to do this would be, like Shari was discussing before, the likelihood of a long-term functional cure, meaning less frequent doses. Well, I don't have too many issues with taking tenofovir daily like I do. It can wear on you sometimes, especially on a hard day, because it is a constant reminder that you are taking a serious medication for a serious disease. And I think, you know, ideally, being able to go in and get a shot or 2 shots or take a month's worth of oral medication and have that be it, that would be a game changer for a lot of patients. I think that it's just a lot of this disease is a lot of projecting into the future sometimes as patients. It's a lot of worrying about what might happen in regards to medication, in regards to your disease progressing, what that could mean for decision making in the future. I just think that the less invasive a medication could be would get me lining up to participate in a clinical trial. I also would be more likely if these were a bit more local, meaning if I could just travel over to Ann Arbor, which is less than 20 minutes away from where I live, to follow up with a trial. I think that would be a much easier barrier for entry than either having to fly out to Philadelphia or Pennsylvania or to another area constantly to do that. It's quite an undertaking to start as a patient. I would say that I still hold out small sliver of hope for an actual cure, but realistically, what I try to think about in regards to future treatments is just effectiveness and least likelihood of serious side effects. Because again, I'm grateful for taking tenofovir, but there are worries I have about long-term effects, bone density, things like that, that another drug, you know, potentially better drug in the future could quell a lot of those worries, and I think would get a lot of patients in the door as far as participating in these things. I think it would be great to have more diversity in medical trials, to have an actual representation of the people that live in the world, and I think just having an honest relationship between clinicians and the trials that they're doing with the public, just making that barrier to access a little bit less scary for people is something I'm all about. Before I go today, I just have some closing remarks about meeting with other hepatitis B patients. Connection is a word I've used a lot when explaining like how I best advocate for being a patient with Hep B, is just meeting and talking to other people with similar or completely different lived experiences, because I just feel like the more we as patients, the more we advocate for ourselves, the more we tell our stories, the more we normalize this disease, I think it's just only a matter of time until our needs are heard, understood, and I believe it's only a matter of time until the stigma and the shame, which is something I dealt with a lot as a younger person, having the stigma and the shame surrounding this disease be lessened over time is something I'm very much looking forward to. I just want to thank everyone for giving me an opportunity, and I'll be around for Q&A. But thank you.
Great. David, thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your personal story, and your perspectives today. Appreciate and admire your bravery. And I was just going to say, similar to what you were saying in your closing remarks, know that you sharing your story is an inspiration for all of us, and it is helping to reduce stigma and discrimination against people living with Hep B. So really appreciate your time today as well. And as David mentioned, please, he will be around for questions, and Sherry and Yasmin as well. So if you have any questions right now, feel free to drop them into the question box, and then we will respond to them after Yasmin's presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Yasmin to share with us findings from international surveys.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, David. It's man, you'll make my job more difficult now. But really, thanks for sharing your experience and your thoughts with us. As we all here today to shed some light on what patients want and need and elevate their voice. Next slide, please. As Sherry mentioned, that the patient engagement program and elevating the patient voice had so many elements and so many platforms to hear the patients and listen to their needs. And in my presentation, I will be talking about the online survey and the telephone interviews as part of the program. The survey was an anonymous online survey. It was global for everyone, both in the US and outside the United States, while the telephone interviews, these are in-depth telephone interviews that they were conducted only with people living with chronic hepatitis B in the United States. Next. And next. So for the survey, again, as Sherry mentioned, the whole idea of all the activities that we have done and all the platform was to document the physical, emotional, and social impact of living with chronic hepatitis B, and get more understanding about the experiences with treatment and the challenges of accessing care and accessing treatment, and the perceived value of current treatments and perceptions on future medications. For the survey, we had 1,700 survey participants, and 15% of those participants were tested because they were having symptoms. That means that 85% were tested for all other reasons, as Sherry shared some of that, either for pregnancy screening, pre-work, pre-immigration, preschool admission. Only 15% were tested because they were having some sort of symptoms that had their doctor or physician direct them to be tested. 81% were less than 45 years old. So the majority, the vast majority were young individuals. However, they had to be above 18 years old to participate, to be eligible to participate in the survey. And they had to be patients, actual patients, not family members. People living with chronic hepatitis B. 67 were male, 83% were living outside the United States, and the majority, or a little bit above 50%, were coming from Africa, and about 21% were coming from Southeast Asia and Western Pacific regions. 50% were Black, where 30% were Asian or Asian American or Pacific Islanders. 53% of participants were diagnosed in the past 5 years, and 56% had experience with chronic Hep B medication. And of those, 79% have been taking their medications only in the past 5 years or less. Next, please. So Today, I'm going to focus more on the lived experiences, the physical and the emotional impact and the of living with chronic Hep B as shared by the survey participants. And it's probably understood if someone doesn't want to share with friends or, of course, co-workers, but it gets really hard when you see that individuals are unable to share their Hep B status with the very close circle, the family members, the spouse and partners. So 20%, 21% were not able to share their status with their family members, and 26% were unable or didn't share with their spouse or partners. So I think this is a journey, and David talked a lot about this, and in this journey, you need to have your support your support that comes through family and through partners and friends, and it gets so lonely. And so, as you can see, it was difficult for them to share their status. Next, please. When asked for reasons why they were not sharing their Hep B status, 37% said that they feared being treated differently, and 33% said they feared facing discrimination, and 24% said they feared worrying their loved ones. Participants were able to choose more than one, and 25% of participants were actually choose more than one reason for not disclosing their Hep B status with people and not sharing their status. Next, please. The emotional burden of living with chronic Hep B is significant. Not to dismiss the physical burden, we'll look at this in the coming slide, but the emotional burden seemed to be very high, even among those who are silent carriers, among those who are not taking treatment. So 62% said that they felt life is less enjoyable, and 58% again feared facing discrimination. And the list goes on and on about their fear about feeling that their relationships have been harmed. They feel shame, and they feel like avoiding others. There was also this major fear about disease prognosis, again, as we heard from David, and as we heard from Sherry about patients participating in the PFDD. So 55% feared developing liver cancer, and 48% feared living a shorter life, and 40% were worrying that they might be transmitting the virus onto others. So this is pretty significant, just to be facing these fears and concerns and thoughts in your mind constantly. Next, please. When asked about challenges living with chronic hepatitis B, and I'm showing here the results by those who are living in the United States and those who are living outside the United States, just to show that these are global. These challenges are global, and even the top three, although they are a little bit different between those living inside or outside the United States, still they are the top three. So managing fatigue, maintaining a healthy diet, or staying current on what is the recent and Hep B research, finding the right information is really a challenge in a way that is digestible for the large audience. So this is really important. So the day-to-day life poses or comes with a lot of challenges too, and it's global. Next, please. When it comes to managing Hep B, again, the same challenges are cited by those who are living inside the United States or globally or outside the United States. But the challenges of access to care, the cost of care, finding a doctor who's knowledgeable about chronic Hep B. These are all faced by everyone. However, if you, as you can see from the chart, those living outside the United States had a higher likelihood of facing all these challenges in terms of cost of care. The idea of going to a doctor for a checkup every 6 months and finding a doctor who's knowledgeable about Hep B, and that's really universal. Even with the interviews, it was always and remains a challenge. It's like for some communities, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. Next. There were, when asked about barriers to access to medication, to hepatitis B medications, again, the barriers, the top three, if you look at the bottom of the chart, the top three are shared by both those living in the United States and international or outside the United States. Again, the cost of medication comes as #1 for everyone, more so for those living outside the United States, especially that most of the participants were coming from low and middle income countries with a lot of known barriers to access to care in general, not to mention access to Hep B, chronic hepatitis B care. For those living outside the United States, outstocks were a major challenge, and for those living in the United States, dealing with specialty pharmacy and dealing with the gaps in health insurance and the language were among the very common barriers cited. Next. Next, please. Thanks. The interviews were audio interviews. We asked potential participants who are interested to submit a short form. We ended up doing these interviews using online platforms. Of course, participation was voluntary. I have to point out that by the time we started conducting the interviews, we were preparing for that a long time before. But when we started, it was at the beginning of the pandemic. And yet, most of those who have expressed interest in participating, they were able to make themselves available despite all the unknown and the uncertainty and the challenges of just making yourself safe and everyone around you and finding all the things that we were all looking for in terms of PPEs or just even toilet paper and that stuff and stocking food, and yet they made themselves available. And they not only that, they also shared precious thoughts and moments of their experiences with us. So I really would like to thank them so much for raising their voice and for sharing their experiences with us. Next. Next, yes. So 50% of, we conducted 24 telephone interviews, 50% were female, 46% were from Asian descent, 21 were Black, either African or African American, and 33% were white, and 63% were currently taking medication for Hep B. Next, please. So nothing on this slide is probably new after all these talks, after Sherry, David, and even the survey. It just confirms what we learned in a more in-depth and and it triangulates and confirms what we've learned. So the physical and emotional impact of living with chronic Hep B is significant. The pain, the fatigue, they are mostly cited even for many who are not on medication. The stigma, the isolation, sometimes anger, not knowing how the disease was transmitted, and fear of developing liver cancer, fear of leaving behind loved ones behind, especially those who are married and have kids. They really feared leaving their kids behind in a younger age, or not being there for them in their special moments, graduation, getting their license, or getting married. The impact of chronic Hep B on their career choices was also remarkable. Many mentioned that they were avoiding even applying for jobs that may require disclosure, and avoiding jobs that may be physically taxing, and definitely even if they want to change their jobs, they were concerned or afraid that they might lose their health insurance, and so they were trying to avoid that as much as possible, to avoid dealing with all these hassles. They also cited challenges managing Hep B, finding a knowledgeable doctor, and the cost of care, even among those who have health insurance, and again, taking a daily pill for life. As you can see, and as we learned from all of this, there's a lot to be done to fill the gaps in the care cascade and fulfill patients' needs. There are several bottlenecks in the continuum of care. We have to work on improving access to screening for early detection and management. As we saw, many they just discovered by chance or by coincidence that they had Hep B, not even knowing how did that develop. Acknowledging the physical and emotional impact of chronic hepatitis B, and acknowledging the struggles faced by Hep B patients, including those who are silent carriers, which means that this should be part of their case management and continuous monitoring, as I'll also elaborate again. We need to raise awareness about Hep B among the public, try to reduce stigma, educate the public. This is not always easy, and this is especially in some communities where the social construct about Hep B is rigid. And this is why for those who have their voice, for those who can have their voice heard, it's really important to raise their voice to, it's like lending their voice to those who don't have it. So it's really important to tell patient stories, as David and many others are doing, because they are, in a way, lending their voice to others who can't speak up. Enhancing the efforts to address discrimination against people living with Hep B, especially the structural and institutional discrimination, and improving the affordability and accessibility to care, educating more healthcare providers about Hep B, especially in communities or underserved communities. It's very difficult to find a doctor. General practitioners or family doctors need to be educated. And finally, developing a comprehensive approach to managing Hep B, educating healthcare providers, policymakers, and the industry, and really developing a comprehensive care approach where it's not only the lab that matters. This is important, but social workers, psychologists, a whole cascade of care, or a whole continuum of care, needs to be available for those patients. Next. That's it. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand it back to Kate.
Great. Thank you so much, Yasmin. And thank you to all of our speakers. A little bit over time, but I see that we still have the majority of our participants still online, and I just wanted to give an opportunity to ask a question, and feel free to drop it in the question box. We'll go for 1 or 2 questions before we close out. All right, and I have a question for Sherry. In terms of, Thanks for turning your cameras back on. In terms of the PFDD meetings, or even for Yasmin, I guess this would apply to you as well. Were there any trends that you saw, not just the difference between the U.S. and abroad, but within the different countries or cultural that you saw related to stigma and discrimination, or was it pretty much across the board?
So I think probably Yasmin with the survey data could talk more about that. We didn't necessarily ask people what their ethnicity or culture was for the PFDD. So maybe Yasmin?
Yeah, well, because also the majority of participants were coming from either Africa or Southeast Asia, Pacific Islander regions. I mean, if we look at these regions have a pretty high stigma about Hep B. So we are still looking further into the data, but again, as we saw from the data, these challenges, the emotional burden, the stigma, the discrimination, it's across the board for everyone. However, it's worth looking into also and seeing. But what we've seen so far is that they are really global. It's just like might be a little bit more here or there, but we didn't see any like country or any ethnicity that didn't really report facing these challenges, either stigma or discrimination.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And Sherry, did you just want to address in general if you saw any specific trends that differed between countries, people that were participating in the PFDD meeting, or cultures?
The U.S. was the only one where we got a few comments about military discrimination, people who were either not allowed to join the military or were kicked out of the military. We did have a number of people who submitted comments to the PFDD from Africa who mentioned discrimination in their attempts to immigrate to other countries to get work visas. So those definitely came from Africa. I'm trying to think if we had any other country-specific ones. We did get a couple of people from, I don't know if they were living in China at the time or if they were from China, but they did mention that even though legally, I guess, discrimination officially is protected against in China, that it's still pretty common for people to be tested and not be able to get jobs if they test positive for surface antigen, and also potentially social stigma considered, so that people might be still considered unmarriageable and not able to share in some of the family things like sharing food bowls, living in a separate area of the house. So we heard some of that from either people living in China or had been living in China.
Great, thank you. And then before we part, one last question for David. David, any words of wisdom or advice for someone who has recently been diagnosed with hepatitis B?
First one would be to just breathe like you normally do. It's a long journey ahead, but there's a lot of support out there for you. Hep B Foundation is one of those supports for me. And I would just say that to take it moment by moment, and your life isn't over, it's just beginning.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much, Sherry, David, and Yasmin, for your time today and for sharing all of that really rich data. And David, for sharing your personal journey with all of us. And thank you to our audience for sticking around a little bit over time. We appreciate your time. And just a last note to please provide your feedback as you exit the webinar today. And feel free to connect with us. Here is our contact information if you have any other follow-up questions. All right, well, hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.